All right, we're going to get started. So thank you and welcome everyone to our BronfTalk. This call is a part of a series of calls that are hosted by the Bronfman community to explore topics of the day with the help of experts who are within our broad Bronfman community. I'm Aaron Steinberg, the manager of alumni initiatives here at BYFI, and I'm really excited to bring you all on for this exciting call. Before I introduce our presenters, there's a little bit of housekeeping to go through. This call is being recorded, so if you need to leave early, just drop us a line afterwards for a link to the recording. Also, obviously, if you want to share it with anybody. Right now, I am going to mute everybody. That's going to allow our presenters to speak without any errant coughs or background noise. But about 2/3 of the way through the call, we're going to switch to questions and answers, and you can unmute yourself then by pressing *6. So we'll remind you later. But if you have any questions,
is there a way to remute then at that point?
Yes, if you press *6 again, you'll remute yourself. If you do have any technical issues during the call, or if you have any questions for the presenters that you don't want to speak out loud, you can email my colleague Eliza Gans at eliza@byfi.org. That's ALIZA@byfi.org. Our call today is about the fascinating role Israel plays as a global leader in water technology. On the call, we have Seth Siegel, who is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Let There Be Water, Israel's Solution for a Water-Starved World. It's a really fantastic book that explores the subplot of water in Israel's history. And actually last month I was home visiting my parents, and my mom and I were discussing her recent trip to Israel, and we both were sharing random water facts, and it turned out we were reading the same book. So go figure. And we do have a special opportunity for the BronfTalk participants on this call. If you're on the line and you're interested in getting a free copy of the Let There Be Water book, just send an email to Eliza and we'll get one out to you. In conversation with Seth today, we have Jordan Hirsch, a 2005 Bronfman alum who is a visiting fellow at the Columbia Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies and also a JD candidate at Yale Law School. He's a former editor of Foreign Affairs, and Jordan has written for publications such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, and Commentary. Just in case they haven't done so, I'll remind Seth and Jordan to press *6 to unmute themselves. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jordan.
Great. Thanks so much. And thanks for everyone for joining the call. I know everyone has a busy schedule, so really appreciate you taking the time out. I have no doubt that Seth and the book are going to be worth your time. So as mentioned, I'm a visiting fellow at the Columbia Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies, and actually recent graduate of Yale Law School as of 2 weeks ago, so I got to update that. But I am especially delighted to welcome on the call today Seth Siegel. Seth has had such a multifaceted and fascinating career that it's impossible to boil his biography down to one or two sentences, let alone paragraphs, but I will do my best. First of all, he's a Bronfman parent. His son Sam went the year before me in 2004, but he's also a businessman, an activist, a writer, most recently the author of this wonderful new book, Let There Be Water, which, by the way, has a great blurb from potential presidential candidate Michael Bloomberg on the front and back. Israel often gets credit for being the startup nation when it comes to high tech and is known for its Silicon Valley-style innovation, but it's not quite as well known for its innovation in water technology. Seth's book tells the incredible story of how Israel turned itself from a water-starved nation into a water superpower, and what Israel can now teach a world that faces increasingly dire water crises around the globe. So we'll be talking about all those things today. And just to give you a sense of how we'll proceed, I'll talk to Seth for a little while about the book, and then we'll have some time for Q&A and try and wrap it up in about an hour. Thanks again for joining the call, and let's get started. Seth, I want to ask you, you've had as mentioned, very multifaceted career. What got you interested in this subject, and what made you take the giant leap of wanting to write a book about it?
Well, thanks. First of all, I just want to thank the Bronfman organization for having me on this call. I know Donna Rauscher is on the call, who's become a very good friend. And, of course, Jordan and I have developed a very warm and wonderful relationship. But I also, for those of you who did not know Edgar, for the past many years, somewhat by luck, when I was a young businessman, Edgar kind of adopted me. And I had many, many lunches, meetings, and phone calls with him, and he was a very special and wonderful influence on my life. And even to this day, I just as recently as a half hour ago had an email exchange with his son Adam. So it's very special. I've been speaking all over the country, dozens and dozens of audiences. But this is a special one for me, and I'm very grateful that this was put together. Jordan, to your question as to how I came to write this book, what happened was about 4 years ago, I was sitting at a meeting at the Council on Foreign Relations where I'm a member, and I sat through a short presentation by a fairly senior U.S. intelligence official who talked about this coming global water crisis. He said that over the next about 15 years, he put 2025 as the date. By the year 2025, he said, that there would be 60% of the world's land mass and about 40 of our 50 U.S. states would be facing water scarcity of some kind or another. And I had two reactions to that. First is that, I'm an engaged citizen and I like to know about things that have deep and profound meaning to our society, and I immediately thought of this as one that would have that. And I was upset about the fact that the government was talking about a coming global water crisis, and I had no inkling at all that there was a problem. If I thought about water problems at all, I thought of water quality, those late-night public service announcements about children in Africa or Asia or South America who just live in dastardly horrible conditions, and it's kind of a moral outrage that the world permits them to die of dysentery and other horrible waterborne diseases. But I never thought of water scarcity as a concern for the world at large. So I went back to my office and I began thinking about it and reading about it, and I thought about it in two planes. One is, what do I need to know about this, about generally, and also as a Zionist and someone who cares so deeply about Israel, I knew that Israel was a pretty dry place. What would this mean for Israel? And I won't go into it now, but I learned all kinds of macro reasons as to why it is almost a certainty that we are going into this global water crisis that this fellow predicted. And in the intervening 4 years, we now have major water problems all over the world, and it's just getting worse by the month. But what I also discovered is that Israel really is a water superpower, as you said in the introduction.
So before we turn to the Israel superpower part of this question, obviously we have California in our minds, and the Flint crisis is still roiling, but I know you learned a number of very interesting facts about how much water just gets wasted on a day-to-day basis, and I was wondering if you could just sketch out 2 or 3 of those facts just to give a sense of scale here. How much water are we talking about here that gets wasted on a day-to-day basis in some of our cities and countries?
We waste and lose water. It's both in ways that are myriad. And so at a time when the global population and U.S. population is growing rapidly and we'll need more water just for that, and at a time when affluence is growing, and that is good for the people but bad for water supply because change of diet means an enormously larger amount of water needed, you're facing a situation where we have climate change is reducing the amount of water supply, where we have pollution, where you live in an industrialized world, where we have enormous amounts of polluted water resources now, rivers, aquifers, lakes that are either unusable or unusable without very expensive treatment. And we have it may have been the thrust of your question, we have a really badly broken global water infrastructure system. Just in the city of Flint, because you mentioned it, just in the city of Flint, the talk now is that to replumb the city, and it's not such a big city, just to replumb that one city, they're talking about spending between $500 and maybe as much as $1 billion to just redo that one city. Around the world, in the U.S., we lose through our bad infrastructure in the West about 1/3 of our water every day. And in the less developed world, as much as 65% of the water every day to bad infrastructure, cracks and leaks in our plumbing.
So we've got a big problem on our hands.
Yeah, big.
So now I want to take a step back, and your book is divided in several sections. The first part of it talks about how Israel emerged from water scarcity and the early part of the state. Why did water become such a big issue immediately? Can you talk a little bit about the pre-state politics of water and why it mattered so much for the Jewish community of Palestine and then of early Israel to get its water situation right?
Sure, and I'll try to do it briefly, but it's a fascinating and rich story. Well, first of all, with the Zionists from the very beginning, with the ingathering, the exiles, and they assumed that there would be very much of an agricultural approach of reclaiming the land. It was part of the Zionist ideology, and therefore they needed to have a lot of water for agriculture. Most of the people on this call, or maybe all, are city dwellers, so they don't know this, but farming, agriculture takes up the vast majority of our world's water. 70, 80, as much as 90% of our water, depending upon where you are, is used of our water is used for agriculture. So the Zionists knew that they'd need large amounts of water, and so that was just part of the Zionist credo. But what happened that really spurred it all, I write about this in my book, what I regard as the starting point of the real transformation, was in May of 1939. Many on this call will remember the British issued the white paper that restricted immigration into Palestine. And the excuse they gave, and in my book I shatter the reason, it was something very different, but the excuse they gave was the fact that there was not enough water to allow more than the number of people who were then there, about 1.4 million people, into the area that today is Gaza, Israel, and the West Bank. And the Zionists panicked about all their brethren and literal brothers and sisters back in Europe, and parents and so forth. They went to the British and said, allow us to show you how you can have many more people come and how we have much more water than you realize. And they developed plan after plan after plan. Before the war, during the war years, even as late as 1944, when there was still a chance of getting a Hungarian Jewry out, the British didn't relent. But by the time the war was over, the Zionists and then the Israelis had what was probably the world's most sophisticated water plan, and they began implementing it almost immediately.
So let's talk a little bit about that. You identify several key technologies behind Israel's water success. In addition to the national carrier, which you just hinted at a little bit in your answer, which was to come, there's desalination, purification of sewage, and drip irrigation, if I'm correct. Can you briefly sketch out the story behind each of those developments, and then talk a little bit about which one you think is ultimately the big success here?
Yeah, well, I think all three are remarkable successes. In the case of drip irrigation, it's purely an Israeli invention, and Israel is decades ahead of the rest of the world. Drip irrigation, for those who aren't familiar with it, and I didn't know any of this myself a few years ago. So the way most farmers irrigate their crops is sort of the way they did in the time of the ancient Egyptians. You flood your field. You turn on a great big spigot and you flood your field, and the water sits there for a period of time, and then it evaporates or gets sucked into the soil pointlessly, and then the plants begin to sag a little bit, and then the farmer does that all over again. That's called flood irrigation. And the Israelis, and one man in particular, a real giant of water thinking, came up with this idea that what would be a wiser thing to do would be to develop a system that just drips droplets of water at the roots on some regular interval. And that new system called drip irrigation, invented in the late 1950s in Israel and implemented commercially in the mid-60s, it was a transformation because it saves about 60% of the water that's wasted with flood irrigation. And as a corollary, unexpected, it produces far larger yields, which is also meaningful for a world worried about food security. Still to this day, the world does not use nearly enough drip irrigation, and I will predict that will change. The second of those three things that you mentioned is the treatment of sewage. In about 1952, and I talk about this in my book as well, I tell the story. It's not an engineering book at all. I don't understand the engineering very much, but I tell the story of how all this came to be, and it's in a sense an alternative history of Israel in the aggregate story of the book. It's not about generals or wars or terror attacks or prime ministers, but about how Israel overcame nearly insurmountable odds to emerge, in a sense, victorious over this terrible problem. But Israel realized that sewage was not just a nuisance, but sewage was an opportunity. And so they began developing these ideas about treating sewage to this ultra-high pure level that you actually could drink it if you had to, but you don't have to. And then they spent about 20, 30 years developing this parallel national water infrastructure system that runs parallel to the freshwater system, but is used exclusively for agriculture, and it's this treated sewage system. It's really quite remarkable, and it adds an enormous amount of water to Israel. And then the third great area, but by no means are these the only great technologies. There are literally dozens of great water technologies that have come out of Israel. And the third great one is desalination, which, again, is not exclusively an Israeli invention, but what is remarkable about it is just like with sewage treatment, which Israel now just by overwhelmingly, by orders of magnitude, leads the world in the usage of it. Desalination, Israel went in very heavy on that in the 1990s with a lot of great Israeli inventions and innovations, and developed a way to desalinate water at a relatively low carbon fuel load and at a very cheap price per gallon. So it has the opportunity to transform the world. I left out one point that I wanted to say about the sewage treatment, which is that in the U.S., depending upon which statistic you use, we reuse sewage at the rate of either 1%, 5%, or at the most, the highest level anyone gives is 7%. In Israel, it's 86%, and there's no other country in the world other than Spain that's even in double digits. So it's very important to understand that in an increasingly water-starved world, Israel will be a model for rich countries that can afford desalination and for poor countries that can't but have sewage like everybody else.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because all of those statistics really beg the question. And I want to talk a little bit about why has Israel achieved such a saturation in terms of these technologies, but the rest of the world is so far behind. What do you think are the drivers behind that? We know a little bit about probably the culture of conservation in Israel. We've all seen the special toilets, those of us who have been there. And, can you talk a little bit about how water is just seen differently in Israel maybe?
Yeah, well, I think there's two significant parts to your question that I'd like to focus on. There may be more, but let me just focus on two. First is, as you hint at, Israel culturally really reveres water. And as I show in my book, in a brief section about the enduring nature of culture, that when the Zionists arrive in Israel, they already had millennia of Jewish prayer and ritual and custom, which was very reverent towards water. The Bible is just filled with talk about water, and holy texts are the same. And for those who are observant Jews, that certain times of the year you pray for rain, and other times of the year you pray for dew, and so forth. So the culture, the Jewish culture and then the Zionist culture, were both very reverent towards water. And therefore it became something that was passed on from parent to child and child to parent, because even to this day, Israeli nursery schools, first grade, second grade, all the way through fourth grade, teach water conservation as part of the health program. How to brush your teeth, how to shower, how to do that effectively, and that water abstemiousness kind of infiltrates people's thinking, and then it stays with you for the rest of your life. But I think the more remarkable part, and this is something that Israel did that the whole rest of the world didn't do, and that is that starting even before it was a state, Israel made certain existential decisions that certain. Everyone on this call obviously has been to Israel, and Israel can be a maddening place. It does many things that very much can be very frustrating. But when Israel makes a decision to do something really great, it's kind of awe-inspiring how well it turns out. And I would argue that there were three great existential decisions that Israel made. The first was, obviously and most famously, was to have a great military to protect the country, and now it's one of the great militaries of the world. The second one, less publicized, but if you think about it for a second, obvious, is Israel has developed the world's greatest immigration absorption system, and people from all over the world come to study what Israel has done. But the third great existential decision was that Israel would never allow water to stymie or slow its growth as a society, as be able to absorb immigrants, or to slow the economy from growing at its complete potential. And because of that existential choice, Israel made lots of other kinds of choices, legislatively, regulatory, management-wise, pricing-wise, and so forth, that led to Israel being this really dynamic and extraordinary place vis-a-vis water today as well.
So that's you bring up an interesting question, because your book talks about how Israel has a unique economic relationship to water, and it's obviously the government plays a very large role in this. Can you talk a little bit about the balance between government and the private sector when it comes to water management in Israel, and just explain a little bit how that system works and maybe how it contrasts with other major developed countries?
Sure. Well, first of all, to understand that Israel, as probably everyone here knows, started very much as a socialist country. But in the 80s and 90s, after the Margaret Thatcher model began to be absorbed and utilized in most Western democracies, Israel divested itself of several dozen government-owned entities. But the one that they didn't was water. In other words, they divested telephone and potash and other minerals and banks and airlines and all that kind of stuff. But they chose of all of those things to keep one and one only, and that is to keep the governance of water in the hands of the people at large. And I think that socialist model has served Israel very well. Even I interviewed 220 people for the book, and I kind of uniformly, some of them were Palestinians, some of them were U.S. government officials or NGO heads, but about 190 Israelis. And I uniformly asked the question of, do you think the system serves Israel well? And I was kind of amazed that even business people, entrepreneurs, and others thought that the socialist model was a very effective one, including people who were very much free marketeers generally. So I think that had a very large and significant piece in the success of Israel. The other piece that I think your question raises is the question of price, and that is that Israel's made a decision to do something that very few countries around the world have done, and that is, again, we don't really think about water very much, and I would challenge almost anyone on this call to tell me what they pay for in their water, and I would bet that nobody could do it. They may know what their water bill is, but their water bill has almost no bearing on what they're paying for in the United States. And so what we pay for sometimes is just a flat fee or a fanciful number picked by the utility, or we pay for the actual cost of pumping it from the reservoir into our homes. But we don't pay the full cost of the entire infrastructure now and 40 years forward of our water supply. In Israel, they've made a decision that government will be removed from the process of water pricing, and everyone as a whole will pay the real cost of the entire system, all the infrastructure, all the management, everything that goes into it. And therefore, the real-world pricing of water, which is not really all that much more expensive than it is in the United States, but the real-world pricing, every penny you pay in water and sewage fees goes into a locked box system that everything then has to be spent on improving the technology and the infrastructure and the management of the water of Israel. And that I would argue is what's yielded the great result it has.
And just to wrap up the conversation before I want to move on to some the geopolitics here. Obviously, when we hear about Israel as a startup nation, sometimes now these days, and increasingly, water tech is included in a kind of series of innovative achievements on Israel's part. It's financial tech or cybersecurity, et cetera. How do you think the water innovation fits into that broader story, and where do you think there might be contrasts?
Well, the pay date to a water invention is a little bit slower than for tech. I mean, we've all read those somewhat remarkable stories of people who start a business in January and sell it in April, for $1 billion. I mean, those stories don't happen that often, but, they do happen here and there. And if not that April, then a year from April. Water is a slower-moving industry, and adoption is slower, and therefore monetization is slower. So I don't think water tech itself is exactly the cognate of high tech. And one of the reasons for that, again, is because we don't charge prices for water around the world. If we did, if people had to make economic choices that I either buy new technology or so I can save on my water costs, then I have no doubt that there would be even more water tech companies and even faster monetizations. But Israel has had this explosive growth in water tech companies. There are now over 300 of them in Israel. And I would argue, and many of them will fail, of course, but many of them have succeeded and will succeed. And I would argue that part of that goes back to that question of culture that we talked about a few minutes ago, and that entrepreneurs like the idea of doing something that's good for their society. And at the same time, the society tries to help those entrepreneurs. So the Israeli government, through the Water Authority, incentivizes every municipality to adopt as a beta site the inventions of some or many of these entrepreneurs, and they do the same thing with farms. So if you're a farmer and you adopt one of these inventions as a beta site, the government will pay you for having tried it out. If it succeeds, you get the benefit of it. And if it succeeds, then the government encourages other farmers or other utilities to roll it out. And that's in stark contrast to most of the rest of the world, where the mindset of farmers, engineers, utilities is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This is the way my father, my grandfather did it. I'm not changing my ways. And in Israel, it's the opposite. Israel, it's constant ferment, and that's like the high-tech sector. It's this constant ferment of how can we make water use ever more energy efficient, water efficient, cost efficient, and that has led to, and time doesn't even permit me to go into many examples, but if during the Q&A people are interested, I can give some examples. But it's really led to an explosion of ideas and creativity. And I hasten to add, by the way, that this is not something that has to be uniquely Israeli. I mean, if the world would sort of change its culture and change its pricing mechanisms, I have no reason to think that Israel is just populated by supermen and superwomen in water. This is something that everybody everywhere in the world could be and should be doing to improve our universal water system.
So speaking of the world, I just want to ask two more questions. We'll open up for Q&A. But speaking of the world, I want to have you talk a little bit about Israel's water diplomacy. I'm sure some people have heard of Israel doing some things in this area, but can you talk a little bit about how Israel has built partnerships around its water technology, and where do you think that's headed in the next couple of years as more and more countries face water crises?
Sure. I coined the phrase in the book hydro diplomacy. And in the world of hydro diplomacy, Israel from as early as the 1950s, when it was actually kind of a very poor, it was a poor country. It didn't yet have anywhere near the reach or the dreams or the reality of this economic success it had. But even when it was a poor country, it was reaching out to Africa, primarily thanks to something that Theodor Herzl wrote in the book Alt Neuland, where he talked about when the Zionists established their state, they must reach out and help the water systems of the Africans. And so it was a fulfillment of Herzl and Zionist ideology. And Golda Meir, the then foreign minister, later prime minister, developed as part of her foreign ministry this outreach to Africa to help them with their water systems. And that grew into a global outreach effort in Asia and other countries and other continents. But Israel also has figured out a way to use water as a way of helping build relations with countries. And I'll give just a couple of short examples. But for example, everyone knows today that Iran hates Israel. But what is less well known, and I would say that this is the first time it's ever been in writing, appeared in writing, is in my book, is that from 1962 to 1979, Israel functionally ran the water sector of Iran. Iran suffered a horrible earthquake that destroyed their irrigation systems, and the Shah quietly invited Israel to come in and help troubleshoot, and 2 or 3 water engineers arrived immediately. And over the next few years, hundreds of Israeli water engineers were in Iran building out and managing their water systems. And then when the Shah fell, and I would argue that was very much helped to open the door to cooperation and a tacit understanding of an alliance. And when the Shah fell, the Iranians exiled the Israelis, obviously, and there's a bit of an Argo, moment where some of the water engineers had to get out of the country really very fast. But they also, in addition to getting rid of the Israelis, they also executed and exiled many of the Iranians who had been trained by the Israelis, and that led to today Iran having among the world's worst managed water systems. Another example, and I'll jump to the future after this one, another example is China made a deal with the Islamic Conference in the 70s and 80s that they would have nothing to do with Israel in exchange for support of the Islamic states at the UN on Chinese initiatives. And I write about this as well. This has also never appeared in writing before, but I tracked down and found out that Israel had been approached by China through intermediaries to send in total secret in the 1980s teams of Israeli hydrologists to study China's already growing water problems and to help them come up with solutions. And the Israelis had to remanufacture the goods, so it would have no Israeli markings on it, repackage it, and then ship it through third countries. But Israel developed this advisory service and trade in water technology with China in the 1980s in secret because the Chinese were afraid that the Islamic states would find out about it. And then finally in 91, China became so self-confident about this and so eager to get more Israeli support in water that they invited a senior Israeli water scientist into China to educate China's leadership, academic leadership about this, and that led directly to diplomatic relations a short time later. And then today, Israel trades its water technology with 150 countries around the world, including many, many, many countries with which it has no diplomatic or formal commercial relations. Israeli businessmen and businesswomen travel to these countries on Israeli passports. in it, making arrangements in advance, and they sell and install Israeli water technology. And I would argue that this is soft diplomacy at its best, and this is a way to open doors. And we haven't talked about the Palestinians very much or at all yet today, but Israel also uses water, I think, profoundly in its relations with the Palestinians to help have an ongoing channel of conversation between the two parties. So Israel uses water as a tool for peace, and if not for peace, always for coexistence, and certainly as an opportunity to change the relationship between what might be an antagonistic state and Israel.
And speaking of going around the world with water technology, you've now been on tour for several months. You've been across the United States. You've been in Europe. I just want to, just from a process perspective, ask you a little bit about the tour and maybe what you've learned from the tour itself that you would maybe include in edition number 2 of the book.
Well, I tell you, since this is the Bronfman group, can I do something that I probably wouldn't do with most other groups, if I may? And that is that I've now spoken to well over 90 audiences and about a dozen universities, and I have been utterly amazed by the reaction of audiences all over the country. Even in schools that are pretty famous for their hostility to Israel and the groups that are Students for Justice in Palestine and groups like that, I've really been amazed by how warmly I have been received. And I'm not talking about by the Hillels and the Jewish student groups. I'm talking about at significant universities where I've spoken to schools of engineering or business schools or public policy institutes filled with grad students from foreign, from overseas, from China, from Singapore, from Korea, from African countries, from South America. And I have been utterly amazed at the degree to which they are not interested in hearing about or talking about politics. They want to talk about solutions, and they see Israel in a kind of awe-inspired and reverent way. And that is very, very exciting. And just last night I was in New Haven. I spoke at Yale University to a joint program of the School of Forestry and the Slifka Center there. And during the Q&A, one of the people came with a non-question statement about how Israel steals Palestinian water and so on and so forth, which, by the way, is just not true, as I demonstrate in my book. But it is a common sort of water libel against Israel. But starts with this thing. And what was fascinating to me was in this audience of about, 70-odd people, that the audience had no patience for her. So that the audience wanted to hear about solutions, and there were some 45 people from the School of Forestry there, and a few, if any, were Jews. I think maybe one or two were, and they were very interested in not talking about politics and very interested in talking about solutions. And I think that this tells us that there's a great story that Israel can tell about how it can be a lesson for the world, which is not for us. Jordan, my politics. I don't think we need to disguise the fact there are problems here, but that there are. But we can also say that there are not just problems, and that we can say that when the world or universities can hear a profoundly good story about Israel, not everybody is out to hate us, and there's good stories to tell about Israel too that is well absorbed and well adopted.
Yeah, that's. On that optimistic note, and speaking of broadening up the conversation, I'd love to open it up for Q&A now.
Since you used the word optimistic, that's sort of a trigger for me to say something else, if I may, and that is that I think we really face a grievously terrible outcome for the world with higher food prices, instability, possibly the fall of states, certainly the likelihood of mass migrations, not of 1 million or 2 million, but of tens of millions of people if we don't get this water thing right. And it could go very badly. We have a very bad global system for fixing problems of this mass scale. But I would say that what makes me optimistic, to use that word again, is the fact that Israel has done such a great job of managing its water. It really is a great model for the world. And just in the past year, 6,000 water officials from countries all over the world have visited Israel to learn what Israel has done in water. And hopefully those are all not junkets, and hopefully people are going back to their native lands and fixing their water problems so we avoid the worst of what may be coming down the road. And if so, then that will be really, if I may get a little melodramatic, that may be a real light onto the nations moment for Israel as well.
Yeah. Well, the last thing we need is more refugee crises and things of that nature,
yes,
particularly in the Middle East. Well, I want to open it up for questions.
By the way, by no means limited to the Middle East. China,
right,
India, South Africa, we're talking about problems far greater than anything in the Middle East.
of course. But if anyone has any questions, remember *6 to unmute and fire away.
All right, well, it's Aaron here.
Hi.
Go
Hi,
ahead.
Yossi, can you hear me?
I can.
Hi, so this is Donna. Yossi, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about...
Just to explain to everybody, Yossi is my nickname. So Seth's on the cover, and Seth is how Jordan has been referring to me. But Jordan, I appreciate your discipline in doing so. Yes, Donna.
It's a mighty struggle. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. And Donna, before I let you go, to the people who are on the call, for those of you who are on Twitter, I tweet about water issues throughout the day, all day long, water and Israel issues, at Seth M Siegel. And for those of you who would like to see my regular blog, I'm the water blogger for Huffington Post, and I also try to do a weekly podcast on water issues. And that's at my website at www.sethmsiegel.com. And if you go there, there's a sweepstakes underwritten by El Al. Very nice of them to offer this to me. And you can enter at no charge and no obligation to do anything, and get 2 free tickets and several nights in a luxury hotel in Israel. So Donna, over to you after the commercial is over.
So Seth, now you've been all over the country speaking about water issues and using Israel as an example. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about why, and maybe just because I'm on the East Coast, why this is not more of an issue here in America. Why aren't we talking about this? I mean, we have these crises, a drought in California, what's happening in Flint, but really it just seems like there's no major policy conversation that's happening, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, by the way, and I think it's at our peril that we're not having that policy conversation. I spend a lot of time with elected officials, and I am routinely startled by how much they know about some issues and how absolutely little they know about water issues. And I would exclude from that maybe a senator or a congressman from a dry state like Arizona or Nevada, but overall, or from a farming district in California, but overall, they really don't think of this in national security terms or economic terms the way they should be. I think the reason for it is, if I can be incredibly cynical, Donna, is that energy and other resources all are private mostly, and they get the opportunity to do campaign donations for elected officials, and therefore the elected officials think it's in their interest to learn about it. And I think that water is mostly held in the name of the people through public utilities, and public utilities are not in a position to be hosting events for politicians. And maybe I'm just a little too cynical, but it's certainly an explanation, if not the only explanation. Elected officials, I would give another reason for it, which is also cynical, and that is that public officials tend to respond to what their citizens are calling out about. And you may know that there's 35% water loss in your city, but so what? It's underground, and as long as you turn on the faucet, the water comes out. You got what you need. And so citizens scream at elected officials to fix their parks or their schools or their hospitals or their roads or to give them tax cuts. But it's out of sight, out of mind. You don't see the water problem. It's brewing slowly, and it's going to hit you with a wallop when it hits, but you don't see it. So politicians don't really have to respond to it. And then the final part of that is politicians take the attitude of very much of trying to get themselves reelected. And since water infrastructure generally takes at a minimum 10 years and maybe even longer to install, if you're an elected official, a mayor, a city councilman, whatever, your attitude is probably, or certainly could be, hey, I'm not going to get any credit for this. Why should I spend money now for doing this and make enemies by digging up people's paths, and they're disrupting their stores and their livelihood? And so therefore they're happy to kick that can down the road as far as they can. And that's kind of what happened in California. I mean, tell me that California drought could not have, or the Texas drought a few years before that the worst of it could not have been figured out long in advance, because it could have been. It could have been, because everyone, there were all kinds of articles by academics and others saying, watch out, something bad is coming, but elected officials didn't do anything about it. By the way, this Bronfman crowd is a particularly engaged crowd. Lots of people here are involved in politics or social leaders and such, and I would argue that my primary reason for writing the book was not just to tell a good story about Israel, but my primary reason was to raise awareness about this grave water problem we have and to give people the tools that they can speak out. And I would hope that people on this call would be glad to help share the word that we have to get on top of our water problems fast.
So, Seth, I just want to follow up on that answer, which I thought was very interesting. I think the perception potentially is that Israel achieved so much in terms of water innovation because of necessity, and there's at least a lack of awareness about necessity, that kind of necessity in the United States and in other countries. How much do you think that's true, and were there other drivers behind the innovation besides simply survival?
Oh, I definitely think it's more than that. I think that because there are other countries that have survival issues and necessity issues. I mean, why are countries in the region like Jordan or why does Jordan or Egypt have such dreadful water systems, or why in Eastern Europe, does Bulgaria and Albania have such terrible water systems? And even, everyone thinks of the Emerald Isle, Ireland, is rain suffused and all that. Why does Ireland have among the world's worst water systems? I mean, why are these all happening all over the world? So if necessity were the only explanation, then everybody would have fixed this a long time ago. I think that this was a happy meeting point between good governance and great ideology, and sometimes it's the opposite that happens. I mean, again, I wrote a chapter about the Palestinians in the book, and I think the opposite you can see when that happens. In the case of Hamas in Gaza, there's bad governance and there's bad ideology. And that has led the people of Gaza to where they're probably 3 or 4 years away from being out of water. I mean, it's going to be a massive humanitarian crisis. Not of Israel's making, but I suspect Israel's going to get sucked into that. And so, good governance, smart governance, not corrupt. I tried to search for stories of corruption in the water industry. Couldn't find one. I thought it'd be juicy to put it in the book. Couldn't find one. And also this smart ideology that we have to always be ahead of the water innovation curve so that we can provide for the future of our people. And also so that we can have food supply that is secure and we're not going to be reliant upon others, because we could be in a siege setting where our neighbors won't let food come in and the Mediterranean could be blockaded. So they have to be self-sufficient in their own produce as well.
So I want to open it back up for anyone else that might have a question. Just feel free to chime in. Again, *6 to unmute.
I've got a question. It's Aaron. I remember from visiting Israel as a child and as a teenager being told to take a very quick shower, don't waste the water, even turn the shower on and off sporadically throughout your time in there. I'm curious, with all the technological advances for water conservation, has individual water conservation in Israel changed? Has the attitude towards wasting water on a micro scale, has that concern disappeared?
It still is part of the culture and education of Israel. All over the country you see those signs, chaval called tipa, it's a shame to waste even a drop. If I had to predict, Aaron, I would predict that as Israel becomes ever more affluent and ever more water secure, that people will be a little less conservation minded. I think that's just the way human that's just the way people act. It's like the people are become sloppy in being careful as time goes by, and I don't understand why anyone would think Israel wouldn't be the same. But I think that simultaneously, simultaneously, Israel is developing. Israel's developing all kinds of great new technologies, and those technologies are leading to ever greater ways of conserving water as well. So the per capita amount of water used in Israel today, even though Israel is far, far, far more affluent today than it was, Israel on a per capita basis uses less water today than it did in 1960, which I think is kind of an amazing number as well. And I would argue that will continue to happen as ever more appliances and other smart uses of water continue to be applied there. And I think that will be the model for the world as pricing starts to be installed.
If no one else has one right now, I just want to ask, we didn't touch on this really, but obviously Israel faces a number of different security threats that we're all fairly aware of: terrorist infiltration, the short and long-range missiles, and cyber attacks. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about what you learned as far as how Israel protects this water infrastructure and the desalination plants and things of that nature.
Yeah. So a lot of what I learned, I was sold sort of for my information only, so I can't share a lot. But I made very clear rules of engagement as to what I can share. So I'm sorry that I can't share everything. And there were also things that I wanted to know they wouldn't tell me. But you're right, the water infrastructure is seen as critical infrastructure, and it's guarded very carefully. It is subject of cyber attacks regularly by outsiders who are trying to disrupt the water flow of Israel. They have a grave concern that their desalination plants are big sitting ducts, and a GPS-guided rocket from Gaza or South Lebanon could very obviously do grievous damage and set it back quite a period of time, so that they have concerns about their desalination plants along the coast. However, they take countermeasures, not just Iron Dome, but other countermeasures to protect themselves against that. And it's worthwhile noting that with the exception of one attack by Yasser Arafat in 1964, there's never been an attack, or there's been lots of attacks on infrastructure. There's never been an attack on a water facility other than that the very first act by the PLO in 1964 was an attack on a water facility. But other than that, Israel has not done that. Israel's not been a victim of terror attacks on its water infrastructure. In terms of the second part that you sort of imply is like sort of the poisoning of Israel's water. That's something that they're very, very focused on, both at the national level and the municipal level. They do all kinds of drills to protect against that all the time and to respond to it. And in addition, they have developed some really world-class technologies that are adopted by water systems all over the world now at some great economic benefit to Israel, to identify within a second or two any toxin entering the water system. And they have developed a system to shut down that source of water instantly and then to replace it with another source of water. That toxin, by the way, doesn't necessarily have to be from a terrorist. It could be a truck that accidentally unloads diesel fuel, which is actually when it happened, diesel fuel into a water supply. It could be some natural toxins that float in the air and that fall in the water. And Israel, I've been the control center, the secure control center for this. It's really kind of very, very cool. Lots of blinking lights and charts and such. And it's all automated. Like 3 people run this system that runs the water of the country. But they showed me how they would know in a millisecond if something was amiss, and they don't have to wait for a human being to touch a button. It just automatically shuts itself down. So that's something that's very good as well.
Great. Does anyone else have any questions they want to ask?
By the way, I just would say one more thing, which is that frequently, but not always, as I said about my trips to the college and universities, where the word Palestinian, I've been amazed. I spoke at some schools that are famous for their Israel antagonism, and not a single question about Palestinians. But I do want to say that I did not duck the topic in my book. And although the Palestinians really add nothing to Israel's water excellence and what it will teach the world, I thought it was important to, because it's been so politicized by Israel antagonists, I thought it would be valuable to have a chapter to talk about Israel. And I tried very hard, and I think this is something that Bronfmanites would appreciate. I tried very hard to write this in a completely even-handed way. I interviewed, as a result, 20 Palestinians. I interviewed several of them multiple times. The Palestinian Prime Minister, Salam Fayyad, sat for 3 separate and fairly long interviews with me, but also Palestinian water officials, Palestinian water NGO heads, Palestinian water academics, and so forth. So I really wanted to get the story right. I gave the final chapter to a bunch of Palestinian academics, and they gave me very valuable comments, nearly all of which I adopted. to make it as even-handed as I could. But I think the unmistakable story is that the Palestinians have a far better water profile today because of their encounter with the Israelis. I'm not saying that they are happy about their national identity or the status of the politics in the region right now. I'm not suggesting that at all. But I think that from a water point of view, they are in a much better position than their neighbors in Jordan and other Arab countries. And that is, I think, because of the encounter with the Israelis. And for those who are interested in the topic, I address several of these issues in both the West Bank and Gaza. They're separate issues, and what the answers are there.
So maybe the best way to close, I know there's been some stories about water cooperation, not just between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, but also with Jordan and projects surrounding the Dead Sea and whatnot. Can you talk a little bit about those projects and where they stand?
Yeah, it's a brilliant project because this goes back to the idea of hydro-diplomacy rather than just pure water. The Kingdom of Jordan is very, very water scarce. It's among the most water scarce countries in the world. They get a lot of rainfall in the winter on the Edom mountains, but they don't have a system for capturing it and conserving it very well. And they don't have a natural reservoir like the Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret, to hold their water. And this has led to all kinds of great opportunities between Israel and Jordan to cooperate. So Israel serves as the reservoir for the Kingdom of Jordan, and there's a system for the Jordanians to put their surplus water when it occurs seasonally into the Sea of Galilee, and then at will to remove it whenever needed. And I'll get to why this is so significant in a minute or two. In addition, there's all other significant kinds of water cooperation, very quietly done behind the scenes between the Jordanians and the Israelis. Again, it'll be very significant in a moment when I get to my punchline. And for all kinds of reasons of not trying to destabilize the king, Israel doesn't talk very much about all this cooperation that goes on, but a lot goes on, and this is confirmed to me by Jordanians as well as Israelis who are involved in this. But the thing that's most exciting is that Jordan and Israel, without any intervention from Europeans or America or diplomats shoving solutions down their throats, Israel and Jordan are developing a bold idea for water integration. And the idea, founded by a rather brilliant Israeli water professor at Hebrew University, then became that apolitical water commissioner of Israel. He came up with this idea that Jordan would pump water out of the Red Sea down near Aqaba and Eilat, would build a pipeline going straight north to the bottom of the Dead Sea. At that point, it would desalinate the water. The fresh water would be then transferred over to the Israeli side and used for new farms in the Arava Desert. The brine that is created, the salty slush that is created by the desalination process, would be transferred into the Dead Sea to help stabilize and slow the evaporation of the Dead Sea. And then Israel would take out of its desalinated water resources up north, would build a pipeline and a spur into Amman, Jordan, and give the Jordanians actually more water than Israel was itself getting. And to make it even better, to involve the Palestinians, Israel would build a separate spur into Hebron and provide Hebron with a very large additional amount of water as part of this three-way deal. Now, the reason I said earlier, I said that I'll get back to the punchline in a second, the reason why all these ideas are so good is not just that there's more water, and that's good for people's lives and their economies and all that, that's all great stuff, but why this is so incredibly great is because it weaves them all together. And so we could all imagine, as frightful and horrible as it would be, the Kingdom of Jordan falling and being replaced by an Al-Qaeda or an ISIS-type enterprise. We could certainly, easily could imagine that. But at some point, Israel and Jordan's water supplies will be so woven together, and Jordan will be so reliant upon Israel, that even were an Al-Qaeda or an ISIS to take over in Jordan, it would be simply impossible for them to sever all connection to Israel. I'm not saying it would be pretty for Israel. I'm not saying that there wouldn't be security threats to a very significant degree. But it would be impossible for them to end all connection and all contact because the water of Jordan would be too reliant upon Israel to continue to do that. And I think that idea of weaving together the reservoir up the Kinneret Sea of Galilee for Jordan, and for the idea of building out all kinds of water systems together, and then building out this particular water system, which will be a multi-billion-dollar boon to the Jordanian economy, is really a act of actual sheer genius in geopolitics and hydrodiplomacy.
That's very interesting.
And I write about it in the book. This is among the first places it's ever been written about.
Well, Seth, thank you so much for a really fascinating conversation. I urge everyone on the call to get their free copy of the book and tell people about it, because it's really a wonderful story, a very interesting story, and there are just so many nuggets that we didn't even get to touch on here today. So definitely encourage you to read it and talk about it more, and very grateful for your time, Seth, and to come on the call.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure. By the way, as I said at the outset, I mean, this is really much a passion of mine. I consider this part of my community service. I'm donating all the royalties to charity, so there should be no ambiguity about my goals here. And the book is done fabulously. It's second printing now, and it's being translated in languages all over the world now. And I would argue that for those on this call, obviously many of whom care passionately about Israel, this may be among the very best, if not the best, stories we can tell right now about Israel to both Jews and non-Jews who either want to hear a good story about Israel or who just want to figure out a way to solve the world's problems and to realize that Israel is, although in the newspapers is often a problem, it can also be a solution.
Wonderful. And thanks also to Bronfman for hosting today. We really we appreciate.
And thank you to Bronfman for giving free books to everybody who asks for it. That's really great.
Absolutely. And I really do want to thank you two as well. Thank you, Seth, for sharing such really great, fascinating information, and to Jordan for some really good questions and moderation. I want to thank the team here, especially Eliza, who helped pull this call together. And again, if you do want that free copy of the book, you can email Eliza at aliza@byfi.org. We did make a recording of this call, which will be available within a couple of days. Thank you to all of you for participating on the call, because that really makes this worth doing and a really exciting opportunity for our community. And I hope you all have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.